Do you know what time it is? I wonder if you can remember the last time someone said those words to you. And maybe it was your boss when you turned up late for work. Do you know what time it is? Maybe it was your spouse who was trying to get to sleep while you stayed up late. And do you know what time it is, darling? Maybe it was a flatmate who caught you having a cheeky glass of whiskey early in the afternoon. Do you know what time it is? It's a bit early for that, isn't it? Those examples, the question's not meant as a request for information, is it? It's meant to make us realize that we're not acting appropriately according to the time. Well, it's that question and in that kind of sense of it that Paul wants to ask us in these verses at the end of Romans 13. Do you know what time it is? And that's his concern. You can see right in the middle of these verses in verse 11 that we understand the present time. Paul wants us to realize where we are on the timeline of history and to think about what kind of behavior is appropriate for the time that we're living in. So first of all, in verses 8 to 10, that means realizing that it's time now to love like the kind of family God always planned for his people to be. Twice in these first three verses, Paul says that love fulfills the law. What does he mean by that? Well, in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, with the law that God gave them through Moses, functioned like a shadow or like a kind of scale model, pointing forward to what Jesus's kingdom would one day be like. And in terms of how we relate to one another, you could really sum up that law as love. Love your neighbour as yourself. And that was the model. And of course, we see throughout Israel's history their persistent failure to obey the law and to love one another as they should have. But now that Jesus has come and he's begun to bring in his kingdom, the reality that the model was pointing towards, and now that, as we've seen earlier in Romans, we've died with Jesus to our old life of sin, and we've been given Jesus' Spirit within us, and now as the church, we're enabled to live this radical way of love. Verse 8 shows us the kind of attitude change that will involve. In general, as a matter of love and fairness, we should seek to pay off what we owe so that we're not in debt. Except, Paul says, when it comes to love. Now, that's a debt we're to always feel like we have to one another in the church. We should never feel like we've finished paying off our debt of love to others. I wonder if you've ever got to that point with a Christian brother or sister where you've had an opportunity to help them and you've thought to yourself, I have done an awful lot for them in the past. I don't really need to do this further thing, do I? I think I've done more than my fair share. Paul says here, there's no point at which we can say, I've shown enough love to that person. Whenever we meet another Christian, we should think of ourselves as owing them love. Be worth thinking maybe about what considering ourselves as having a debt of love towards others in our DG group is going to look like during this strange time of social distancing. And what will that mean when we're tired or when we feel like joining yet another Zoom meeting is really quite an effort? The encouragement for us in these verses is that as we continually express that kind of sacrificial love for one another, we're actually living out the beautiful pattern of life that the whole of the Old Testament pointed towards. Isn't that exciting? And now is the time for us to love like the kind of family God always planned for his people to be. It's also the time for us to wake up and get dressed. And that's the point of verses 11 to 14. In verse 12, Paul says, the night is nearly over, the day is almost here. And night and day there symbolize the age of this fallen, sinful world that's passing away and the glorious age to come, the day of the new creation that is breaking in now as we're transformed by God's grace, and that will come in fullness very soon when Jesus comes again as King. And so Paul says to us, wake up. The hour's come for you to wake from your slumber. I don't know how disciplined you are at getting up in the morning, or how many times you feel like you can afford to hit the snooze button on your alarm before you realise you just can't do that any longer. You've just got to get up. Paul's saying here, at the day of salvation, at the day when we see how foolish and how bad for us sin was, that day is just about to start. So don't hit the spiritual snooze button. It's time to get up and start living something of the glorious sin-free life that we're going to enjoy in God's presence forever. And don't keep living in darkness. And put aside those deeds, those old ways of life, sexual immorality or quarrelling with others, and instead put on the armour of light. We're to clothe ourselves with Christ-likeness, Paul says. When lockdown began, I wonder if you were one of the people who looked at this strange period ahead and thought to yourselves, well, here's a time when I'll be able to get on with all kinds of personal projects I'd always been intending to do, but have just never found time to get around to. So, I don't know, it'll be a chance maybe to learn a language, or to, take up the bagpipes. I hope you haven't done that if you're living with others, by the way. That would be a very bad way of putting love into practice. I wonder, though, if you've thought, now is the time to be growing in Christ-likeness. Because Paul says that's how we ought to view the whole of this strange in-between period while we're waiting for the glorious day of Jesus' return. We're to be putting on the clothing of righteousness that we're going to be living in forever in paradise. Our old life of darkness is behind us. This is no time for spiritual snoozing. It's time for us to wake up and get dressed.